Hi there. In this video, we're going to be discussing the final exam. So basically what I'm going to be doing is just running through kind of module by module what we've discussed in this class. I'm not going to reteach anything here other than just to say that these are the things that we discussed. I hope between this and the printed study guide, you will be able to compare what we're discussing here and on the guide itself with your own notes that you've taken throughout the course of the semester to prepare for the final exam. Okay. So I'm just, like I said, just going to run through the topics. Once again, if you have any questions, we do have a discussion board up. You can see that. You can email me directly, and I will do my best to assist you in getting ready to take the final exam. So in Module 1, we talked about basically the sociology of social problems. We discussed the sociological perspective and how social problems are constructed. We specifically, obviously, talked about critical constructionism, a main theme going on in this course. It's how it is a combination of conflict theory and symbolic interactionism. We discussed the very important topic of hegemony in society and what that means, and of course, contradicted to sociology and determinism with the idea of free will and human nature. And again, you've written about many of these topics already. We took a look at how do we compare societies with one another. We took a look at cross-cultural explanations for many of these topics, as well as a global perspective. We talked about the role that corporate America and the media play, the divergence between big business and big government in our society, and how culture around the world is becoming more and more and more homogenized. In Module 2, we started discussing the topic of capitalism and inequality. So we compared and contrasted two economic systems, both capitalism and socialism. We talked about the idea of wealth inequality in our society and how that's come to be, using very specific descriptions of how those things, how the wealth inequality that exists in our society today came into be. So we used terms such as the Gini coefficient, tax regression. We looked at the idea of shareholder capitalism, as well as the effects on our infrastructure in society, which we term public squalor. We talked about poverty and its absolute and versus relative measures of poverty. We talked about the actual definition of how to establish a poverty line in our society and that policy. We talked about homelessness in our society. We talked about global inequality, the idea that not all the world is necessarily equal among all the nations. And we talked about how that came into being, as well as the roles that things like foreign debt and corporate interests and the idealization of gross domestic product has contributed to those. In Module 3, we started talking about this concept of the inequality of life chances. We definitely described inequality from both the perspectives of Karl Marx and Max Weber. We talked about two socially constructed categories that contribute to inequality and to social institutions. So for the categories, we talked about inequality in race. We talked about the idea of race being a social construction, some of the consequences of that race plays in our society and its economic consequences to groups. We talked about prejudice and discrimination, as well as a possible solution in affirmative action, as well as some of the arguments also against that. We talked about inequality in gender. We talked again about gender as being a social construction, that the role that male corporate culture plays in perpetuating this inequality a lot, the ways that we are socialized into specific gender roles in our society and around the world, and the role that occupational segregation plays. We also talked about the inequality within the social institution of education. So we talked about a very popular construction of education and the value of college to obviously college students. And then for the second social institution, we talked about inequality in relationship to healthcare. Again, a very popular construction of healthcare, as well as ideas that have been forwarded in our society, specifically regarding healthcare reform. Also, at the end of Module 3 because it seemed relevant to the topic. We'd also discussed issues regarding immigration. In Module 4, we discussed problems of the family. So we talked about this popular construction that a breakdown of the family exists or has existed in our society. We talked about the traditional kind of breadwinner housewife model that's entered popular culture as kind of the ideal form of family, even though we know, again, consequentially, that it's not always quote unquote possible for all people in society. Based on all sorts of factors, but mainly socioeconomic. We talked about the modern family. We talked about the reality of the necessity for women to work outside the home. We talked about issues of family bankruptcy. We talked about the incredibly alarming number of children living in poverty in our society and what some of the consequences that is having on our society, as well as what is a possible solution as the human capital perspective. We talked about the relationship between a capitalist system and the family. We talked about issues of same-sex marriage and kind of the overblown issue in our society of children having children. And then in Module 5, we started discussing issues of crime and deviance. So again, we took a look at the functional definition of crime, especially Durkheim's ideas about why crime is not necessarily quote unquote bad, but also plays some vital functions in society. We talked about this relativity of deviance, the idea that it's not the act itself, but society's reaction to the act that determines deviance. And we talked about it in two ways, both by examining societies cross-culturally, but also over time, temporarily. We talked about the popular construction of crime and how that's come to be in our society, especially a focus on street crime. We talked about the idea of how the media covers crime, as well as what we sometimes refer to as kind of overblown crime scares in our society. And you've written discussion boards about that. We talked about how we deal with punishment in our society. In other words, society's actual reactions to crime and deviance. So we talked about issues such as the death penalty, incarceration in our society, and I presented you with my the American Prison Frenzy presentation. We talked about the consequences of having a criminal record in our society. We talked about the birth and growth of the what we call the prison industrial complex in our society, the idea that incarceration, especially prisons, have become more and more privatized, and some of the consequences of that. And then we compared our society with other societies in the world as far as their methods of addressing or dealing with or reacting to crime. We talked specifically about several issues very important to our society in relation to this, the war on drugs. We discussed in some detail. We talked about the trend toward the medicalization of deviance. In other words, treating deviance or what we might call problem behaviors as mental health issues and treated with medicine. We talked about the idea behind street crime and corporate violence. Again, and pointing out that while our society tends to focus mainly on street crime, there is a substantial amount of harm done in our society on the level of corporations. And then we talked about the issue of terrorism. How do we define that? And what are some of the issues, both present day and historical, regarding that? All right, in Module 6, we talked about problems related to the environment in our society. We talked about the role that technology plays in our culture and around the world. We talked about the idea of scientific uncertainty. Excuse me. The idea that there's not a science in the world that's 100% accurate all the time, but some of the problems that causes. We talked about again, historically, how society has sometimes responded to issues of the environment, and then the role then that corporate suasion plays in countering many of those. So that idea of exploring this scientific uncertainty, the role that public relations plays. We talked about a specific issue of something abbreviated as SLAPS, SLAPPS, strategic lawsuits against public participation, and the role the media plays in advancing corporate interests over the concerns of the environment. We talked about consumerism and the role that that plays in exacerbating many of these problems in our society, and specifically a very good example of how the automobile has played a huge role in shaping American consumerism. We talked about how reactions to environmental problems are unequal in society. We talked about the idea of environmental injustice in our society, as well as how natural disasters disproportionately affect um, lower socioeconomic groups in our society. And of course, we also know around the world, again, back to the idea of global inequality, that there's certainly an imbalance between the ways that climate change is affecting the world, the nations of the world. We talked about the various and differing goals of both the global north and the global south. And we talked about this kind of again, disproportionately overblown idea of overpopulation in the world. And then in the last module, we concluded. So we kind of talked about critical constructionism and are there solutions to many of these problems. We talked about, again, the role that corporate interests are playing in our society, some of the issues and problems having to do with that, but also are there some possible solutions? And we listed many of them, one of which included definitely the role that college students play in that. And then, of course, we just kind of wrapped up the semester. So those are the things we've covered this semester. Again, many of these should sound very familiar to you, having done the discussion board and examination assignments. If you do have any questions, of course, there's a discussion board for preparing for the final exam, which you may use up to the time you take the final exam. And if you have any other questions, you can feel free to contact me directly. So everybody, please read the guidelines for how to complete the final exam and the deadline at which it is due. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get back to me. Okay. Good luck, everyone.